Sergey Viktorovich, thank you so much for taking the time. We have a lot to talk about, and it's not for me to tell you that the situation is not easy. It's been a little over a month since the Alaska meeting. In 2 days, it will be 8 months since the Trump administration came to power. And you know much better than anyone that it looked very promising in Alaska. And we all know from Donald Trump's public statements that when he entered the White House, he gave us grounds, well, if you want, for serious hopes. And where are we now in Russian-American relations? Still, I would like to disagree with the fact that we had serious hopes when Donald Trump won the election and entered the White House for a second term. We definitely appreciated his openness and directness earlier, and we appreciate it now. He never wriggled. He doesn't hide his thoughts. And we appreciate his focus on results. What he calls deals in the broadest sense of the word, including mutually beneficial projects in the economy, in space, in the development of natural resources, and modern technologies. But he had the same attitude during his first term. But then, of course, the Democrats, speaking in Russian, put a pig in Donald Trump's mouth when, a few days before Trump's inauguration, Obama imposed completely unjustified sanctions against us, expelling more than 100 diplomats and their families from the United States, and arresting 5 objects of diplomatic real estate, which was inherited by Trump. And I remember how Mr. Flynn, who was running for National Security Advisor at the time, called our ambassador and said that the Democrats had acted meanly. They wanted to prevent our relations from developing normally. They had left such a legacy. We kindly ask you not to react. We will fix it all. They failed to fix it because the deep states in Donald Trump's first term, of course, were immeasurably more influential than they are now. And the fact that the 47th President of the United States, as I understand it, has drawn very correct conclusions from previous experience in preparing for a new presidential term. And now he is asking for slightly different forms of communication with this deep state is noticeable. Moreover, Donald Trump has formed a team of like-minded people, such a strong and influential team. He had nothing like this during his first term. And the way he defends the interests of the United States, I think, is completely different from the ideologized policy of his predecessors, who, led by Joe Biden, essentially set a course for the complete isolation of Russia when they gathered around themselves the entire Western camp, which willingly united around such an aggressive confrontational policy. And, of course, at that time we didn't have the opportunity to talk at any level at all. The only exception was in June 2021, when President Putin and Biden met in Geneva. By the way, there was a good conversation, but it didn't lead to anything. So, probably, all this was a cover for the deep-seated aggression that was maturing against the Russian Federation, a cover for the line that the Democratic administration pursued to suppress Russia as an independent player. As for the new administration, the situation is different. Of course, America is number one. We need to make America great again. All of this reflects such major strategic directions of American policy under any administration. But I have already told you how our first meeting with Marco Rubio took place in February in Riyadh with the participation of Yuri Ushakov and Mike Foltz, who has now been confirmed as ambassador to the United Nations. We spoke very frankly, and Marco Rubio began bluntly by saying that the current American administration in the field of foreign policy does not proceed from any ideologized postulates, but from national interests. And they understand perfectly well that all other countries also have the right, especially the great powers, and they also have the right and grounds to proceed from their national interests. And then Marco Rubio said something that I fully share. In those situations, and there are relatively few of them, when great powers have the same interests, it would be a gross mistake not to use this coincidence to turn it into mutually beneficial material projects that will bring economic benefits to partners. And in those cases, and most of them are, when the national interests of the great powers do not coincide, it would be a mistake or even a crime to allow this discrepancy to turn into a confrontation, especially a heated confrontation. I absolutely agree. This is the policy, this is the line, that President Putin pursues in the international arena, looking for common ground and not allowing disagreements to flow into such a hot confrontation, but also into a cold confrontation. It is better not to allow this. But in Alaska, this approach was fully confirmed. As you know, the Alaska meeting was preceded by several visits to Moscow by Steve Witkoff as President Trump's special envoy. He met with President Putin, and as a result of these visits, the Americans formulated their approach to the problem of settlement in Ukraine and how they see the role of the United States. Unlike all other Western figures. First of all, of course, such European leaders as Starmer, Macron, Ursula von der Leyen, Merz, Alexander Stubb is actively striving to join this team, as well as Mark Rutte, without him anywhere. In contrast to their actions and their positions, which was that Ukraine was right, that's all. Therefore, it is necessary to inflict a strategic defeat on Russia, restore sovereignty within the borders of 1991, that's all. In contrast, Trump and his team have repeatedly shown, including publicly, an understanding of the need to address the root causes of the conflict. Donald Trump has said this publicly more than once, that drawing Ukraine into NATO was a mistake, and he has clearly shown that for a settlement it is necessary to forget about these encroachments and build security on other principles. And secondly, the Americans, the current administration, are well aware that the realities on Earth are explained not by the fact that someone wants to cut off territories from someone, but by the fact that people live in these territories, which we now control and which are still partially under the control of the Ukrainian armed forces. And their rights, linguistic, religious, whatever, were legally destroyed. The Russian language is banned in schools, universities, and all levels of education. The Russian language is prohibited in the media. Russian language media outlets, both owned by Russian and Ukrainian owners, are closed in Ukraine. Books in Russian were thrown out of libraries. Well, it's the same as Hitler did in the 1930s. Only the fascists burned these books. And Ukrainians are an enterprising people. They turn these books into waste paper. And they also receive money for it. Russian cultural events are taboo, but also in the store, in everyday situations. If you come and ask for a pack of salt in Russian, the seller may well say that he will not serve you until you switch to Ukrainian. And, of course, we mentioned at the talks in Alaska that, among other things, the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church is also banned. And I hope I'm not giving away a secret. President Trump was shocked and asked Marco Rubio several times if this was true. And you could see his attitude to this kind of thing. Therefore, understanding these root causes also led to the specific proposals that were put on the table, which assumed that the interests of the Russian Federation in ensuring its security were taken into account, bearing in mind the NATO factor, and which assumed the fate of those people who live in the relevant territories. This has entered the media space under the heading territory exchange. But we talked about what I just said. And, as I understand it, it was also reported that following the meeting in Alaska, Stephen Witkoff conveyed to the Ukrainian side the American vision of how to move forward. taking into account the understandings reached in Anchorage. And this signal was rejected by the Ukrainian side. Therefore, yes, we want to maintain the dialogue that has been established between our presidents, between the heads of foreign policy departments, and through other channels, between national security aides and special representatives of the two presidents. And we see that the same desire is being observed on the American side. Yes, the Ukrainian crisis is in the foreground now. But from the numerous speeches of Donald Trump, from his statements that if he had been president, this war would never have started. And this was repeated in Alaska. And President Putin supported this assumption. And Donald Trump's statement that this is Biden's war, not Trump's war, in general, reflects the situation when he really pays priority attention to overcoming the Ukrainian crisis. But this is not because he himself considers this crisis to be the navel of the earth or the main conflict on the planet, but because Trump inherited the situation in international relations when the Ukrainian crisis was artificially created. Russia was left with no choice but to launch a special military operation to protect the rights of people whom the authorities in Kiev, who came after the coup, declared terrorists, non-humans, creatures whom Poroshenko publicly promised from high tribunes to rot in basements, and whom Zelensky, calling them creatures, recommended them to get out to Russia if they live in Ukraine. But they feel involved in Russian culture. After our several proposals, I am ready to talk about them in more detail later, about how to establish security in Europe, taking into account the interests of all participants, including Russia, Ukraine, and Western countries, all European countries. All this was rejected last time. We started making such offers in 2008, and all this was rejected over and over again. And for the last time in December 2021, proposals were made to conclude treaties between Russia and the United States, Russia and NATO. And we no longer have any other choice after the negative, even such an arrogant and contemptuous reaction of the West to these proposals of ours. That is, what happened. The West has done everything to ensure that Ukraine, or rather, the anti-Russia, made of Ukraine, and set against the Russian Federation in order to contain, weaken, and suppress it, so that it takes a leading place on the world agenda. And my feeling is that precisely because this is an artificially created war by Biden and his team that does not reflect the philosophy of the current administration. The Trump team wants to remove it from the agenda in order to remove obstacles to normal economic, technological, and other cooperative relations. It will not be easy, because the United States has a very peculiar approach to how to solve economic issues now. But we can talk about this later. Dear friends, I kindly ask you to like this video and subscribe to my channel. Thank you.